We have with us Mr. Pati Singhania, who's the CMD of JK Paper and also the first Vice Chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, speaking exclusively to NDTV. So thank you so much for taking out the time.
Pleasure to be here.
So my first question to you is that we talk at a time when the world economic landscape is changing. There's a fair bit of headwinds, some would suggest, also when it comes to trade and several other aspects. How do you see that shaping up over the next couple of quarters or maybe a year from now?
Well, this is a challenging time. But having said so, this has remained fairly turbulent ever since we've had COVID. And on the global environment, while we see a lot of uncertainties, there are also opportunities because of these adversities, for people to actually act and do things. So on the one hand, you are seeing a situation where we are finding global trade or a globalized environment as we had envisaged earlier to be becoming increasingly difficult. But you are also seeing an increase in regional cooperation, because at the end of the day, business has to grow, business and trade. And we have seen that trade, global trade, has brought millions of people out of poverty, particularly in developing countries. So global trade is beneficial for all. The challenge is how are we going to achieve it? And this is a challenge for business as well as for government and policymakers. So that is really a scenario which we put in front of us. And I think ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce Paris, one of his main jobs is to facilitate global trade. So we work on areas of how we can get trade finance. How do we bring in supply chains? How do we include SMEs, which are really the ones which generate large number of jobs? How do we include them in the entire
Supply chain,
in the entire equation? And today you have other factors as well. And maybe I'm jumping ahead of what you might have thought in terms of this, but today issues like climate change, issues like digitalization, all of them are mixed up in this.
Absolutely. And before we get to some of those, speaking on trade, there is an election happening in the US and Donald Trump, it looks like a race that could go down to the wire. And if Donald Trump does come as the next president of US, how do you think it would impact trade ties, and in terms of the whole tariff equation? And how do you see ICC being and the role it may play in terms of ensuring that these trade tensions do not overtake a bilateral relationship?
See, this will be challenging. Let's not kid ourselves. But at the same time, I think every country realizes the benefits they can get from lower cost sourcing. So while countries want to, rightly so, look at their own domestic issues and domestic job creation, etc., they also have consumers and the same people who benefit from more efficient production that could happen somewhere else. And hence the issue of trade across borders. Now, ICC works very closely with the WTO, and ICC has special groups with the WTO, where we try and see solutions that will be in the interest of different nations. So it is not one versus the other. And then you have also today a situation where you have trade in different kinds of products and services as well. So ICC works on this. ICC has policies by which it has standard formats of model contracts. It has things where we are trying to work on digitalization. So you have in trade, you have documentation, for example.
I understand that it may not just be a bilateral relationship that ICC would focus on, but the fact that US may come out with more trade tariffs is not a problem that will be unique to India if Donald Trump comes to power. So how does that become then a bigger challenge, not just for India, but for some of the other countries as well, developing countries? And how do you envisage, any such mechanisms to be in place to ensure that they are tackled and don't become a larger geopolitical issue?
See, ICC will use its position and efforts to advocate with different policymakers and governments. So while I mentioned the WTO being a larger sort of multilateral organization, but bilaterally also with governments and policymakers or with trade blocs. ICC works with them to talk to them as to what would be a sort of a reasonable level of tariffs which balances local issues along with benefits that come from global trade. Along with this, trade finance is a very important part as well.
Yes.
You can't do things without having access to trade finance. And that is why it is very important to draw in small and medium enterprises, because they constitute a large workforce and job creating part of it. And how do we bring small and medium enterprises into this entire chain is equally important. And ICC has developed certain tools for it.
Right. What you mentioned climate, you mentioned sustainability as a key area. How do you see that shaping business discussions going forward? How do you see organizations and associations like ICC sort of shaping a larger conversation around climate change going forward?
It's a very important question. Today, it's not about just moving goods across from one country to another. It's about how sustainably they have been produced, and how are they going to be accepted by a customer. Because today customers are making choices in terms of whether these goods have been made in a more sustainable manner, or they have been made in a manner which is less friendly for our globe and for our earth. So therefore ICC tries to bring in, we have a climate action change policy. We are working with various groups. ICC is a part of all the COP discussions.
Yes.
And so ICC tries to put together policies or advocates for policies which are going to be fair and progressive, and what we would call a just transition of energy, or just transition in climate issues, as well as advocates to its members the importance of sustaining, getting into sustainability and being conscious of climate. Again, I'll bring in an issue I've talked about earlier today, which is about the small and medium enterprises. Now, the large enterprises in their own way can find ways, and they know how to do things and navigate this.
It's funding the smaller guys.
It is funding and also the knowledge level of the smaller enterprises. How do they have access to this knowledge? How can they develop their processes which are more eco-friendly?
Yeah.
And funding.
Without hampering their business interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You raise the issue of funding,
Yeah.
which is very, very important.
Yes. And as leader of the global south, or as as India aspires to be the leader of the global south, it's this transition to ensure that its practices are more sustainable, and how it can offer more solutions to the developing world would be really very important. How do you see that marrying into the ICC's interests in terms of ensuring that path is available for smaller companies, as you mentioned, companies coming out of developing countries? How do you see that?
See, ICC has developed certain tools for SMEs. There's something called an SME 360X. There are other online tools that ICC is now trying to develop, which are to do with climate change, which are to do with other contracts and dispute resolution mechanisms, which are aimed much more at the smaller sector. Now, what is important in the point that you raised about the global south, as you know, in the last B20 summit we had in India, Prime Minister Modi raised the issue of the global south. Yes. And it is the global south, or the developing world as we used to call it earlier, the African countries, a whole lot of other countries in Latin America, in Asia. These are the populous countries. These are the countries which will actually show growth, because the developed countries have already reached a certain level of growth in population and demographics, and therefore their growth rates are going to be far more moderate. So the global economy is going to be powered by these. And the opportunity here is because they are at a developing stage. We can craft and engineer not only policies, but technologies and methods of working, of manufacturing, of doing things, which ab initio you don't have to dismantle a legacy system, and you're starting with a system which can be far more eco-friendly and sustainable. ICC works with different national committees ICC has national committees all over the world, including India. And it works to advocate this part as well. How do we bring these businesses together on a common platform, on a common understanding, so that the whole issue of climate can be addressed in supply chains. Now, today, in many cases, let's say Europe, today there are issues around the CBAM, the carbon adjustment mechanism, which is from a European standpoint understood, but from somebody exporting into Europe, it seems difficult because there are tariffs. There are other enactments which are to say that if your supply chain or even your raw materials of your supply chain are not in conformance with, say, deforestation or many other practices, your end product cannot be accepted by customers. So therefore, all of these require two parts. They require an understanding by the producers of what the regulations are. And on the other hand, they require us to have the time and the path to have a just transition onto this. Just by putting one tariff or just by putting a regulation in place, things are not going to automatically happen.
You mentioned that India's role in the global economic order comes at a time when the developed world is facing very depressed growth rates. US is also set to enter in a depression, or some say they've already entered into a recession for sure. In the backdrop of that, with some of the developing countries really powering the global economy, will that reset some of the priorities of ICC going forward?
It already is doing so. So I'll give you one example, where today the board of ICC are the representation of members from the developing world or the global south or whatever you would call it, is far more than it has ever been. We have also looked at much greater gender equality on the board now, and we have far more women members on the board. This is one example. So it is showing up the concerns. If global businesses are to grow, global GDP is to grow, the concerns of these developing countries have to be kept in mind. Yeah. You can't ignore them. And if you don't keep those in mind, we won't achieve a proper growth path. So, and I think there is a recognition across the world, including in the developed countries, about this issue. And ICC definitely is playing an integral part in this.
And then let me, this brings me to my last two questions, which is around technology. There's enormous focus on technology transition, technology transfer, and technology essentially leading the next wave of manufacturing revolution as well. India being no exception to that. We're trying to catch up on the semiconductor bus and so on and so forth. How much role do you think organizations like ICC could play in this tech transition for countries like India, which also need to catch up, but also have a lot of advantages right now as compared to some of the other countries?
So technology, and I would add the word innovation today, is the other part of this, which is really going to power the way. And we are seeing the effects of technology, particularly digital technology, artificial intelligence coming in, machine learning, and a whole bunch of other things, and they're happening at a very rapid pace. One of the roles of ICC is to bring awareness of the rapidity of these changes to our constituents and members. The second part, which is very important, and which you have sort of raised in a way, is technology also requires to be adapted in things like, let us say, documentation. So when banking is online today, when we have trade documents, we talked a lot about the trade part of it, but trade to a great extent has still been, on a physical format. And there have to be standards. So each country has different standards. So one of the things that ICC is trying to do is we have something called a DSI, a Digital Standards Initiative, wherein we have put down a whole range of trade documents that are required on a digital format, which will be standardized so it can be adopted by different nations. And they are working more, including more and more, sort of documents and more protocols which will be common. So if you don't have these as common, We may want to have greater trade. We may want to have, technology. But if technology doesn't talk on a common platform, it becomes difficult. Yes. So it's very important so ICC is playing a major role in this part. You are familiar with things like Incoterms, which is, ICC's creation. That is being digitalized, and a whole bunch of other things. So ICC is playing its part on the documentation and policy making, and hoping that different nations adapt the same standards so that there can be enhanced growth and participation globally.
Final question on the financial inclusion and the financial framework that is being put in place now. There was also the G20 declaration which spoke about financial inclusion, essentially taking forward what some of the models that India has created, UPI and others. How do you see that becoming a bigger play going forward? I'm asking this because developing countries need more of that. Those frameworks are not in place there. And also they are the ones driving the global economy going forward. How much of a role would ICC play in standardizing some of those frameworks?
I think ICC will play an important role. I just mentioned the role of, for example, DSI, the Digital Standards Initiative. I think India has done an incredible job with our digital stack. And the most important part of that is how it has brought in inclusivity and transparency. Now, if this can be done in a country which has such a large population, the most populous nation on earth, why can't it be done in other nations so that they can benefit from this? And really, it is this part which will be essential. Now, there are other examples in other countries. You know, for example, in Africa, in Kenya, many years ago, they had adopted this M-Pesa, where money, because they had no physical, they had a lack of opportunity of doing physical money transactions. It was all done digitally. So countries adapt and do things. ICC is trying to bring in a common standardized framework as far as possible so that this can be done.
All right. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Singhania,
Pleasure.
for taking out the time.
Pleasure.
Thank you.